You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood, art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today we're going to be looking at Alberto Giacometti. Recently, a Giacometti sculpture called Grand Tête Mince, which translates to large thin head, made headlines and shocked the art market when it went up for auction. Many of the high-profile auctions of artworks are somewhat performative, with deals for the buy being quietly worked out ahead of time. This was a truly open auction with no guaranteed price. Only about half a dozen copies of this sculpture had been produced, and of those, only one had been painted by the artist himself. One of the unpainted bronzes sold for $53 million in 2010. This piece going up for auction was the truly one-of-a-kind hand-painted bronzes, and ahead of the auction, it was promoted as one of the main attractions of the sale. Sotheby's produced a video about the work, shining a spotlight on the piece they estimated might sell for over $70 million. But 4 minutes after the auction began, everyone in the room was shocked to find it didn't sell at all. That's not to say there was no interest in the piece. Bidding got up to about $64 million before it was pulled, likely because it failed to meet the seller's reserve price. Certainly nothing to sneeze at, but millions short of the expected sale price, and not even half the record-setting $141 million paid for another Giacometti sculpture in 2015. With Giacometti's work generating headlines, I thought now is the perfect time to look at the man behind the art. Alberto Giacometti was a towering figure in 20th century art, a sculptor, painter, and draftsman whose obsessive investigation of the human form had a profound and lasting impact on modern art. He was an artist's artist. His name is synonymous with the elongated figures and the post-war existential angst, the themes of alienation, solitude, and the fragility of human life. Alberto Giacometti was born in 1901 in the Swiss mountain village of Borgonova. He was immersed in art from his earliest years. His father, Giovanni Giacometti, was a respected post-impressionist painter, and he actively nurtured Alberto's talent from an early age. Alberto completed his first oil painting and a sculpture of his brother Diego, who would become his lifelong assistant and model by his early teens. Giacometti enrolled in Geneva's art school in 1919, and in 1920 he traveled to Italy, where he saw work from traditional Renaissance masters, notably Tintoretto and Giotto. This trip is also where he was struck by the stark power of Egyptian art, which significantly influenced his sculptural vision. During nearly a year in Rome, he tirelessly copied the work of old masters, but he said he experienced a profound despair in seeking to capture a, quote, true life hidden behind the illusory realness of the material world, end quote. During this time, as he was grappling with the art and somewhat disillusioned by all that, he also witnessed the sudden and tragic death of Peter van Meurs, a Dutch librarian and a traveling companion of Giacometti's. This experience left Giacometti contemplating his perception of mortality and human vulnerability. It laid the groundwork for his complex artistic journey, simultaneously exploring the enduring forms of ancient art and the fleeting, fragile nature of individual existence. In January 1922, Giacometti arrived in Paris. It was the center of the 20th century art scene. He enrolled in Antoine Bordelet's sculpture classes at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, but he became dissatisfied with the traditional approaches, and he would later dismiss this as his, quote, period of the Academy. In 1926, he moved into a small, humble studio that would become his lifelong artistic sanctuary. His brother Diego had joined him in Paris the previous year and quickly became an indispensable studio assistant, model, and a skilled caster. During these early years in Paris, he embraced post-cubist styles and the expressive power of so-called primitivism. He took inspiration from African and oceanic art. And around 1929, he was introduced to André Breton's Surrealist circle, who recognized Giacometti as one of its most original sculptors. His work delved into themes of the unconscious, dreams, and desires, aligning with Freudian psychoanalysis. Perhaps his most iconic surrealist piece, The Palace at 4 a.m. from 1932, was a fragile skeletal construction linked to personal memories and dreams. It was acquired by MoMA in New York in 1936. He would have his first solo shows in Paris and New York. In 1935, though, Giacometti and the Surrealists appear to have had a nasty breakup. He had decided to return to working from live models, which was seen as too strong a commitment to the tangible human presence. The Surrealist movement was so conceptually driven, they took this as almost like an act of treason. Surrealism had allowed Giacometti to shatter academic constraints, but he wouldn't be constrained by that movement either. His ultimate concern lay with the real, palpable presence of the model. His small Montparnasse studio, much like his art, became a profound reflection of his artistic process. Its confined, cluttered nature fostered the intense, repetitive observation that characterized his method. As Jean Gurnay later observed, the studio itself seemed one of Giacometti's most important artworks, a microcosm of his internal world and artistic struggle. His expulsion from the Surrealists was kind of devastating. It led to a lot of introspection, but also a creative block. He was driven to understand the human head, and he thought it would only take him a few weeks, but it stretched into a 5-year obsession from 1935 to 1940, working largely with his brother Diego as his model. He stopped exhibiting. His sculptures began to shrink dramatically, some reaching only a few centimeters in height. All of this a direct result of his attempt to capture figures as perceived from a distance. He said, quote, "To my terror, the sculptures became smaller and smaller," end quote. And all of this was made even more difficult as he suffered personal losses with the passing of his father in 1933 and his sister in 1937. And then, we can't forget, the outbreak of World War II. Giacometti was in Geneva from 1942 to 45, unable to return to the occupied Paris. Diego remained, though, safeguarding the studio. In a makeshift hotel room studio, Giacometti continued his obsessive work on tiny heads and figurines, often mounted on disproportionately massive bases to accentuate their smallness and the engulfing space. This isolation during the war likely intensified his introspective process. He had to draw more and more from memory and his own unique internal vision. In 1945, though, Giacometti was able to return to Paris after the liberation, and he entered his most celebrated period. His small studio, preserved by Diego, became the birthplace of his signature style, the haunting, elongated figures with rough, eroded surfaces. He explained to his gallerist in 1947 that he believed his figures achieved a true likeness only when they were tall and slender. These expressive sculptures resonated with a lot of people during the post-war period, as people were obviously happy and relieved the war was over, but they were also dealing with the trauma, anxiety, and everything they had endured from the years of conflict. The physical and psychological effects of war don't go away just because a treaty is signed. But during this post-war period, Giacometti re-immersed himself in Parisian intellectual life, deepening his friendship with philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre became a key interpreter of his work, linking it to existentialism. He credited Giacometti with a, quote, Copernican revolution, end quote, in sculpture for choosing to sculpt what he called situated appearance, figures marked by distance and subjective experience. Although Giacometti resisted the narrow philosophical labels, insisting his primary concern was rendering his perception of reality, his work became almost a symbolic embodiment of the existentialist movement. The studio was cluttered, but all of it seemed to be the result of his relentless efforts, and it took on this almost like ritualized space. His demanding working method involved models remaining immobile for hours on end. Now, Annette Arm moved in with him in 1946, and then they got married in 49. And she became his most important female model, patiently sitting for him almost daily. Diego remained his indispensable male model and assistant, while he worked with frenetic energy, perpetually convinced he would never achieve an exact image, often destroying the previous day's work. Now, I've always loved Giacometti because while so many artists' work are polished and refined and seem almost effortless, his drawings showed this energy and the struggle with the creative process. And I think that's what resonates with a lot of people. It's not necessarily conventionally beautiful, but there is a beauty in the process and the struggle and the sense of striving that we see in here. I mean, there's this palpable energy, and we can see he's making all of these marks. He's constantly revising the work, adding, and you feel like he's trying to capture what he sees, but the perfect rendition of that vision is elusive, and yet he still persists. Because while perfection may be elusive, progress is always attainable. And every time I look at one of Giacometti's paintings or drawings, I'm reminded that there's something beautiful about the process of creation and revision and improvement. Because with every mark, with every revision, it gets better. And better is good.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.